On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, my colleague Lee Sondano and I start a conversation on Catholic social teaching and the development of that in the thought of G.K. Chesterton and his contemporaries, known as distributism. This will be a several episodes long series, but today we get started with a little look into the origins of modern Catholic social thought. Stay tuned. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense. My name is Joe Grabowski, the VP for Evangelization here at the Society of G.K. Chesterton, and I'm joined by my colleague, the VP for Operations, Lee Sondano. Hi, Lee.
Howdy, Joe. How you doing?
Pretty well, thanks. And just before we get started here, as I mentioned to the viewers, those tuning in, this will be the beginning of a series that we're doing, and we'll kind of talk about why that is on the subject of Catholic social thought, the Catholic social magisterium, and then how the thought gets developed through other thinkers such as G.K. Chesterton. But if you're interested in this content, if you think others are interested in this content, be sure to give us a like, leave a comment about it down below. Share this with your friends. Make sure if you're on YouTube, you hit the subscribe button. All those things that help us to grow this podcast. We really appreciate that. We do want to reach more and more people with this because we think that we have a hunch, let's say, that in the coming weeks and months and maybe even years, we'll be talking more and more about these topics. And we think that the Chesterton Society in particular, because of G.K. Chesterton, our patron, we have something to say about this, and we want to make sure that our voice is part of that broader conversation. So thank you in advance for doing all those things. And with that, Lee, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you to sort of take the lead on this one and get us into the discussion.
Sure. No, and this is an exciting opportunity for us, I think, just in talking about the conversation. Like you said, there's a lot of newness going on. We have a new pope. I'm in a new central office building here in Minnesota for our society. So our background's a little different. So we're excited about that. It's summer outside, Joe, in Minnesota, and that's new. And so we're enjoying the newness, but also maybe a slight tinge of old coming into the new, especially with Pope Leo XIV and choosing that name. What the significance of Pope Leo XIV is, and how that ties into Pope Leo XIII, which of course, as a society and as Chestertonians, we have are quite drawn to, just because of, like you said earlier, distributism. So, would love to talk about kind of the newness of that. How it's tying into the old, and who Pope Leo XIII is. Maybe that'll give us some clues into why Pope Leo XIV was chosen as a name, and as maybe a direct succession of Leo XIII and what he stood for, and what was maybe going on back then, what's going on today that may be relevant as to the name. So yeah, let's start with that, Joe. Why Leo XIV? I think that's what everyone was asking a couple of weeks ago, and doing a lot of research online. But why Leo XIV?
Yeah, well, so Cardinal Prevost, then Cardinal Prevost, in selecting that name, certainly, had thought about it. And this is something that, kind of inside baseball for those, especially who are non-Catholics, but even Catholics may be unfamiliar, who don't follow conclaves as closely. So during that interregnum, after the death of Pope Francis, while the cardinals were meeting and having discussions, the cardinals whose names, let's say, are towards the top of the list, start to get word of that. They start to hear that their name is being tossed around, and maybe they start to think about, what would I do if I get elected pope? So ideally, anyway, at the end of a conclave, it's not going to be a huge surprise. If nothing else, it takes a couple of ballots at least within the voting for the cardinals to settle upon a choice for pope. And when somebody sees that their name is in the ascendancy in the first round of voting, let's say, they can begin, if they haven't thought about it before, they can begin then to think about what am I going to do? Who am I going to choose? And so that's evidently what our current Pope Leo XIV, did. And as he expressed it, in meeting with the Vatican staff and cardinals after the fact, after his election, as he expressed it, one of the intentions he has is to sort of bring that Catholic social magisterium, that Catholic social tradition forward and address it to particular issues having to do with new technologies, arising emergent technologies, particularly so-called artificial intelligence. This has been something specifically that has been mentioned and now remarked by various news media. And so that is really what inspired Leo the 14th. But we can talk about kind of, okay, well, that just begs the question, right? Who was Leo the 13th?
Right.
What is he dealing with at his time, right?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too because Francis was, of course, the first Pope Francis, and then you have a new pope that comes in, and he's hearkening back to, I think it's the late 1800s, right, with Pope Leo XIII, which, of course, for us on the society side, we know a lot about Leo XIII just because of Chesterton and some writings. But let's dive into that a little bit. What about Leo XIII? What time frame are we talking about? And maybe some historical context around Leo XIII.
Absolutely. Well, it's kind of a fascinating biography, and there will be others out there who are doing the lifting of really telling us about maybe his pre-papal career, his pre-pontificate career. But he was born in 1810, and so he lives really in the midst of what is sometimes known as the long 19th century, the period from sort of the age of revolutions as it happens in the late 18th century through World War One. There's something different about this time in history, and we'll probably maybe get into that. But he's born in 1810. You got to think about the revolution in technology that happens during Leo's lifetime, Pope Leo XIII. That is, in 1810, even photographs weren't a thing, and yet he lives to be the earliest born person captured by moving pictures, by moving film.
I
And
can't wait to put a pin in this just because of what we're talking about with Pope Leo XIV and especially about AI. And now we're talking about Pope Leo XIII that was around before the photograph.
well, exactly, right. And he lives through really the major period of the Industrial Revolution. So,
Right.
and we'll try to have a little clip. Maybe we could play it over while we're talking of this moving picture of Leo XIII. Um, and so it's kind of a fascinating time. Now, meanwhile, you have all this social upheaval happening. Again, beginning at the end of the 18th century, with first the United States revolting, but then you have the French Revolution, and then you have revolutions all over the place, especially in the middle of the 19th century, the so-called age of springtime of nations, which is the year 1848. And 1848, this is also when Marx and Engels are working on the Communist Manifesto, and this is when Charles Dickens is writing things like Hard Times in Bleak House in England about this new kind of industrial wave, and this is also when you experience a huge blight of potato crop and famine in Europe, and which leads to a wave of immigration into the United States. So, if you're not a student of history, you can really miss kind of just how revolutionary this period was. But by the time of the conclave that elects Pope Leo the
Doesn't
13th,
sound like our day and age at all, by the way.
yeah, right, you're right.
Sounds pretty calm.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, if anything, yeah, this is a very chaotic age in which we live, and sometimes we can think it's the most chaotic ever. But I think to have lived through that time, again, just to be born when there's no such thing as photography, and then to see movies happen within your lifetime, or at least silent moving pictures, what a mind shift that would have been. What
Yeah.
a total paradigm change. And so, by the time of the as I mentioned, the conclave in 1878 that elects Pope Leo, a lot has changed not only in culture but also at the Vatican. So with his predecessor, who is the longest reigning pope ever, maybe apart from Pope Peter, if you just count him in the list. But the predecessor to Pope Leo XIII had been a very long reigning pope, and during that time, Vatican I, the council, is convened, and so you have this major change in the church, which is the expression of the dogma of papal infallibility. And now suddenly the papacy has this more prominent role kind of in shaping the life of the church and in speaking to the nations. And at the same time, you have the Italian state decide, you know what, we're not really fans. We're not really fans of this whole Vatican being free thing. The Italian state starts to coalesce into the Italian states start to coalesce into the Italian nation, and they capture Rome in 1870, and this begins this era where the papacy refers to itself, the popes refer to themselves as prisoners in the Vatican.
Mm-hmm.
And so Leo XIII will be elected in 1878, and he will be one of these prisoners in the Vatican. He never leaves the Vatican from the moment that he's elected. So it's just
how many years was that he was since he was elected and spent time at the Vatican and didn't leave? Just to get
so 1878 to 1903. So again, he ends up being, I think, the third longest reigning pope behind Pius the, I guess it was ninth, and then John Paul II, right? So very, very long reign. It's very providential, right? God saw fit, just as with JP2, you could argue, after Vatican II sort of starts this turmoil in the church, but also the middle of the 20th century and the dropping of the A-bomb had begun this turmoil in the world. God thought, you know what, you need a rock of stability. And so we had this long reigning pope. And throughout this tumultuous 19th century, the Holy Spirit, in his providential wisdom, decided maybe the church needs to be stabilized and have these long-running pontificates. So Leo XIII rules for a long time, and boy, is he productive. I guess he has nothing better to do since he can't leave the Vatican, but what he tends to do is write. He just writes. He ends up writing 88 encyclicals. That's not including all the apostolic letters, the speeches, the exhortations. But right from the word go, just as, Leo XIV, the first act of your papacy, the first encyclical especially that you might release, is going to be a huge symbol of what your kind of preoccupations are going to be. So Leo XIII is crowned on March 3rd of 1878. And then the 50th day, or the Pentecost of his pontificate, as it were, in April of that year, April 21st, he releases his first encyclical, and the title of that one is On the Evils of Society. So it kind of tells you this is who Leo XIII is going to be. It's very much going to be the church, the papacy in particular, which has now been kind of put on this, I don't want to say pedestal, but put in this area of prominence, this role of prominence by Vatican I. Now the papacy is going to be speaking to the world and in many ways contra mundum, against the world, against this modern.
I think that says a lot, right? I mean, especially with the choosing of the name of Pope Leo XIV and thinking that you're maybe, walking in sort of the footsteps of your predecessor, even though it was, 100 plus years ago. 150 plus years ago, it may say something to what we're seeing today. A lot of people are interpreting there's a lot of instability, not just within the church, but across societies in general. And maybe this is an opportunity for the church to then kind of lean into, maybe you're another prolific writer that we need, maybe another theologian that's coming up through the ranks and able to really define things a little more clearly for us, and not to project that into the future or into our current pope, but maybe it's an opportunity there, like you said, to set the tone for this era, for this generation.
Yeah, and maybe to be that kind of countercultural witness that the church has sort of been in every age, but maybe in an intentional way with respect to matters of theological anthropology, human economy, and the way in which we generate and procure and share wealth within our society. I think that these are things that I have a hunch we're going to see kind of taking shape and taking shape in a way that is precisely constructed as sort of against the spirit of the age, against the prevailing notions of the period.
Right. Now, Pope Leo XIII, he was a Thomist, right? I believe so, and so there's a lot there with that. Of course, our current pope is Augustinian, so I don't know if there's many parallels that we can draw there, but it would be interesting to maybe take a side street on that one in our conversations over the next couple of weeks to kind of interpret what that means with both of those just being two completely different schools of thought, right?
Well, two distinct schools of thought, I would say. I wouldn't say completely different. I mean, Thomas is a Augustinian, at least in some ways, right? I mean, he's constantly quoting Augustine, but certainly distinct philosophical approaches, especially insofar as Augustinianism seems to, in many ways, kind of grow, at least in Augustine, out of the Neoplatonist school, and doesn't have engagement with, say, Aristotle. Whereas, of course, for Thomas, he's very much recovering and utilizing the categories of Aristotle in his thought. So there are those sort of distinct approaches, but of course, when it comes to, especially, I would argue, when it comes to matters of polity and when it comes to matters of government, I think that's where I would say that's where St. Thomas Aquinas is most firmly ensconced in and indebted to the heritage coming from St. Augustine, city of God and that kind of thinking. So now that's just my opinion. Maybe different Thomists would disagree, but Leo XIII, as you mentioned, he was certainly very much a Thomist. As a matter of fact, he's the one who really kind of says that Thomas Aquinas is going to be the theologian of this age of the church. He's not really for all time or whatever, but he's saying, in this period, Thomas Aquinas is going to be given privileged place of theology, particularly in the teaching of seminarians and in the formation of priests, and that comes to have a massive impact on the 20th century of the church, that kind of Thomistic shift.
So we have this first encyclical from Leo XIII on evils of the society, right? That really sets the tone of his pontificate. Coming right out of the box there, cracking on a fantastic title for a first encyclical, but not his most famous encyclical, right? I would say probably his most famous one, and we're gonna dive into that a little bit, is Rerum Novarum, right? And so what's I guess so. Jumping from On Evils of Society to Rerum Novarum, what does that look like in that history there? Of course, we know that he's locked up in the Vatican. He's writing a lot of encyclicals in a row. Was it something that just came naturally? Was it in response to something else? Kind of what's maybe the genesis of Rerum Novarum in and of itself?
Sure. Yes to all of the above. It's definitely naturally springing from kind of a necessity of the time, but it's also just sort of the natural progression of Leo's thought. So I'll kind of address both of those. First of all, the title, the Rerum Novarum. I have a little bit of a bugbear about this, in part because I studied in seminary, studied theology, read this encyclical, and nobody really pointed this out to me. That because I had taken Latin and I knew just enough Latin to be dangerous and to get things wrong. And so I could parse the words, Rerum Novarum, res novum, or res nova, that just means a new thing. And so you would think that incipit of this encyclical means on new things. It does, literally speaking. If you're just breaking the words down, it could be of new things. However, that particular phrase, res nova, in Latin is an idiom in Latin, kind of, a word that, even though it means one thing literally in connotation, and in anytime you see it pop up in writing to anybody educated in Latin, at least classically, they're going to recognize that it means a specific thing, and it means revolutions. So this is an encyclical on revolutions, on the revolutionary change having taken place in society, and that's what he's going to be concerned with.
Got it.
But there's a few things that are happening. Labor movements have begun, and also begun to be in violent conflict with ownership. This is partially through the agitation of the socialists, of the communists, and we'll talk about what Leo has to say to them. But it's also partially just because ownership is calloused and unconcerned towards the plight of the working man, which Leo equally condemns. So while he will condemn socialism in this, he equally condemns that kind of capital ownership and way of conducting business that is unjust towards the working man, or unconcerned with his struggles.
And all of this is kind of coming from, of course, the Industrial Revolution, changing a lot of the structure of how workers are doing their work. They're moving from farm and field to city and to mass production. Yeah, I mean, so of course, a lot of just the change in the way that people are working had a lot to do with kind of the lineup of, okay, now we're having to think about workers. Now we're having to think about fair wages. Now we're having to think about conditions of work and things like that. I can't help but think of some of the parallels that we have today, with even our current technology of thinking we went through this huge industrial revolution, in the late 1800s, and now we're coming into this, artificial intelligence sort of revolution ourselves of what does it mean to now be a worker in the kind of the post-information age, right?
Right. And the church is just sort of socially, because of sort of the accidents, or if you want to maybe refer to it, the serendipities or the providential waves of history. The church is, well, first of all, by mission and by calling, the church is on the side of the poor. But the church was also just demographically sort of in the position of very often being alongside this new poor, right? Because it is a new poor, a new poverty, a new kind of lower working class, and kind of indentured servitude almost that arises at this period for various professions. And in many places, again, just because kind of the accidents of history, they tend to be the Catholics, right? So Cardinal Manning, for example, because England, sort of the ruling class, the educated class, the upper class, the ascending class, they stole all the wealth from the Catholics at the time of the Reformation, right? So you have a few recusant Catholics who are still wealthy and landowning in England, but for the most part, they're Protestants, right? And so the people that are going into the mines, the people that are working at the docks, working in the fluff factories, things like that, a lot of them are going to be of the Catholic faith, and that's where a lot of these priests, parishioners are going to be. And so one of the influences upon Leo XIII is going to be Cardinal Manning, who also is a major influence on Hilaire Belloc in particular, and then kind of, by extension on G.K. Chesterton. So, you have to think about that too, just that Pope Leo, in looking at this situation, is kind of hearing, especially, I would argue, from bishops in the Anglosphere, in England and in the United States. These are who, these bishops' flocks are the poor working man who is being ground down by this new system of capitalism. And therefore, because they're being ground down by this new system of industrialized labor, they are susceptible to the evil lies of the socialists. And so, again, it's sort of that both end. We're going to probably in this episode further and in the future episodes in this series, we'll definitely have some harsh things to say about a certain way of practicing capitalistic economy.
And this
You always
wasn't
want to listen for the both end. Yeah, that's my point. Just listen for the both end, because and if you take that soundbite out and you just post it online, then people are going to say, "Oh, you're a socialist." Well, no, hardly. This is the thing. You have to be able to kind of find that third way of speaking about these issues. Sorry,
Sure.
I cut you off.
No, and that's fine. And I think it's important to note as well that Rerum Novarum, it wasn't the first of its kind. I mean, the church had been thinking about this even long before some of the issuance of that encyclical by Pope Leo XIII. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit as well. This is something that was developing through the Catholic Church as an understanding of a lot of different things. I think we have a great quote that we pulled here. I don't know if you want to read through that, but it seemed like it was there was an opportunity to combine a lot of what had been happening over the years into the powerful encyclical that Rerum Novarum is.
Yeah, exactly. So the beginning, towards the very beginning of the encyclical, Pope Leo XIII writes, "On former occasions, when it seemed opportune to refute false teaching, we have addressed you in the interests of the Church and of the common weal, and have issued letters bearing on political power, human liberty, the Christian constitution of the state, and like matters." And so there's sort of a preamble, and viewers, listeners,
we've been doing this. You haven't been listening.
Yeah, and if you're doing your homework when you're reading Rerum Novarum, you might go through that paragraph very quickly and not realize this, but I do encourage you. I won't read through them. Well, no, I will really quick. So there were 4 prior encyclicals that Pope Leo had written, Pope Leo XIII. Inscrutabile Deo Concilio in 1878 on the evils of society. That's the first one that we mentioned, his very first encyclical. De Eternum in 1881 on the origin of civil power. Immortali Dei in 1885 on the Christian Constitution of States, and Libertas in 1888 on the nature of human liberty. And these are precursors to the present encyclical, precisely called out by Pope Leo XIII in the first paragraph. And it's not merely to acknowledge that we're doing a similar thing here as then, where we're addressing social ills by adding our voice to the conversation and speaking on behalf of the church in an emergent crisis, but also to remind, I think, to remind the readers of this, the diligent readers of this encyclical, that this encyclical doesn't stand alone. It doesn't stand, apart from a wealth of tradition and former teaching and all of those things on, what is the proper function of and structure of a state? What is a state's purpose after Christ? What is the ultimate common good of the state? Spoiler alert, to get you and I to heaven, right? So that's a very different conception, notice, too, first of all, from what atheistic communism would propose, but also from what modern secularized states would propose, where the best closest thing they could get to that is like, well, we'll prevent other people from interfering with your pursuit of liberty and your pursuit of a virtuous life. But they take a very hands-off, like, no, it's not the state's job to try to get its people to heaven. There is a sense in which, in the Catholic social tradition, we'll talk about this more probably in future episodes, where that is precisely the ultimate aim of the just state is the best perfection of man. And so that's just a totally different concept than kind of modern libertarianism or extreme liberalism.
Sure, right. And I think we have to remember, too, just to remind the listeners, that we're talking about an era before photography existed. This isn't where the internet existed, where email blasts from the Vatican came out of new encyclicals, right? So you're listing off, 5 different ones that were kind of the precursor to Rerum Novarum, and just thinking about how the word would have gotten out back then. It's a lot slower of a pace. So it was a slow drip, Joe. It was a slow drip, right? Of the kind of these thoughts of how the development of what it means to be in the world, right, as a Catholic and as the church, and what Catholic social teaching really means. And you can see it through its development through those earlier encyclicals, and then of course we're gonna, I think, maybe dive into Rerum Novarum here, as kind of that main sort of culmination, like we said, and maybe a more lasting document just because of its breadth and its depth, and its detail. So again, like you pointed out, not prohibiting the all of the other encyclicals that came out. It was the same message, right? It was just tied together a little bit differently, but it really is, I think, a masterpiece, right? So maybe we can talk a little bit about Rerum Novarum. So
Yes.
a little bit with you said it's sort of an idiom there of revolution, but maybe talk about what's the subtitle Rerum Novarum. What is it really trying to get after, and some of the dates around that as well.
Yeah, well, before I get to that, just one quick thing based on what you noted there, which is that news doesn't travel that fast back then, and then as into the 20th century, whether you're talking about Humanae Vitae or whatever it happens to be, there, one of my old theology professors joked that if you want to keep something a secret, write it in a papal encyclical, right? It's a great place to hide information because nobody's going to read it, right? And that was sort of, that's the prevailing wisdom, especially back then, and especially again in the Anglosphere, which is in many ways a target audience of this. And yet, while he had written those former things, I think those former things in many ways just resonated in the tenor of papal pronouncements in this 19th century, where papal infallibility. So there's this sort of contra mundum, we're complaining about the state, we're complaining about secularism and secular governments, and they stole our lands and all this other stuff. And it was very easy for even Catholics to very, very much tune this out. Not so Rerum Novarum. When Rerum Novarum lands, it is taken up. Sections of it are reprinted in newspapers in native languages. It's a bomb. It drops into this cultural, and part of that is, again, just because sort of the tensions between labor and capital had grown to kind of a fever pitch by this point, but also the practicality and the real nitty-gritty way that this talks to the issue. And so the English translation of the title, we go with Rerum Novarum on revolutions, but another common title for the encyclical, which is even acknowledged in a footnote of the piece, is On the Condition of the Working Classes. And so this is the church that cares in a very particular way about the poor, really kind of addressing the plight of the poor.
Very specific, right? I think, you look at the titles of those other encyclicals, on the evils of society, very broad, on the origins of civil power, you're talking about these really kind of large things that are being boiled down. But when you talk about on the condition of the working classes, I think people's, they start to tune in a little more clearly. Wait, that's me. That can absolutely be me. And maybe that had something to do as well with kind of the effect of Rerum Novarum when it was first released and why it was being republished so frequently, just because it really was talking to specifically, to these groups where some of these other ones may have been interpreted as talking more broadly.
Yeah, and it's there is sort of the sense in which the only alternatives that people, whether they were educated or even just the workers who were hearing things maybe secondhand, they had been sort of forced into this sort of false dichotomy themselves of thinking that, well, everything that's been said about this has been said, and now you just have binaries to choose from. So if what the socialists say really is untrue, then I guess I'm just stubborn to this life. I have to be obedient, and you can understand from that how kind of a hopelessness would take over, and the message that man everywhere is in chains. That message would resonate, and then suddenly here comes the Catholic Church, cutting through the noise, through the voice of Peter, through the voice of the Pope, and acknowledging that yes, what's going on is a mess, and it is degrading to the human person. It is not God's plan for humanity, and it is endangering both lives and souls. However, what the communists have to offer as their solution is equally poisonous, and therefore we propose this better way. And so this becomes what is sometimes known as the Magna Carta of Catholic social doctrine. It initiates this period where the church is going to be increasingly attentive to these kinds of practical concerns and speaking with the wisdom of tradition and the wisdom of the gospel into matters of political economy in a way that really hadn't been done outside of theology before. This is so why do we speak about this being kind of a big revolution? Because a lot of these topics were left for the work of the theologians, Thomas Aquinas, people like that. And while yes, they're doctors of the church, even what they have to say, as seriously as we must take their opinions, they ultimately resolve into that opinion. This is opinion. Now we have church teaching. Now we have a magisterial guide, even though, yes, a lot of this will ultimately resolve in prudential judgment, but we have a authoritative voice telling us this is the way properly to form the values with which you approach these questions. And that's a huge contribution, and one that I think we have yet to take seriously enough as sons and daughters of the church.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so just to give a frame of the time frame here that we're talking about. So May 15th, 1891, right, is when Rerum Novarum was written. And it's so successful that we're still even talking about it today. and it's anniversaried by even later popes, right? So we're even today looking at the anniversary of when this was first released, as I guess May 15th. So it was about a half a month ago or so. I'm still revisiting this text, right? Still looking through the text and diving into it and seeing how it's applicable to our lives even today, which I think is utterly incredible to think about, especially when you're talking about a document that's 130 plus years old.
Yeah, and nearly every anniversary after the 40th gets marked. So you have the 40th anniversary quadragesimo anno, which we talked about the confusion of translating Rerum Novarum. There's no doubt here. The 40 years, right? Quadragesimo anno, 40 years since Leo said this thing. And then you have, the other ones that are numbered by date are octogesimo anno on the 80th anniversary, centesimus anno on the centesimus annus, on the 100th anniversary. But you also have others interspersed therein. I can't remember whether it's Solicitudo Rei Socialis or Laborum Exercens by JP2, but one of those falls on the 90th anniversary. You have other ones that are, maybe if they're not precisely on the anniversaries, they're definitely kind of seeing themselves as part of this tradition. And everybody lends a hand. I think the only pope after Pius XI, who writes Quadragesimo Anno, the only pope that doesn't kind of throw his hand into this is Pope John Paul I, and that's for understandable reasons. He didn't really have time for much in his short reign. So it's just a remarkable thing that the Catholic social doctrine has become, this body of thought, so much so that we even have, we'll certainly recommend this, the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which is kind of a one-stop shop.
Fantastic document. Yep.
Consider all of this magisterium and the wealth of the theology and church teaching that has gone on in the past,
Yeah. And maybe we'll make sure to link some of these things for people in the show notes as well. But just thinking in this time frame, we're talking 1891 when this is released. There's a lot of civil unrest. I think we're in the middle again of the Industrial Revolution, which is changing a lot of life as we know it. What are some of the key principles that are addressed in Rerum Novarum? Where is this hitting? What is the focus of it, at least initially, and then I think we're probably going to get to the conversation, of Chesterton as well, and Belloc and others, and how they're kind of keying in on distributism from this document as well. But what are some of the key principles, first and foremost, of Rerum Novarum?
So in many ways, you could say all of the major themes of Catholic social thought are here, at least in inchoate form. So the doctrine of the common good, the universal destination of good, the preferential option for the poor, all these things which we'll maybe systematically treat of in the future are there. But really, the fundamental issue that Pope Leo wants to talk about is that revolutionary change has occurred. He says that the hiring of labor, the conduct of trade are concentrated now in the hands of comparatively few, that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. He is speaking about industrial capitalism there, by the way. It frustrates me to no end when I hear Catholic social thinkers or Catholic commentators referring back to this encyclical and beginning with, what's its main point? To condemn communism. That's so simplistic, and it just misses the point. He first of all condemns the prevailing system. But then as he goes on, he says that what the socialists have to offer in response not only hurt the working man further, but also violate principles of justice. So he says they rob the lawful possessor, distort the functions of the state, create utter confusion in the community. And he says that the denial of private property, in particular, strikes at the interest of the wage earner. So he's not necessarily saying that wage relation is an ideal, but he says, given that most people right now are dispossessed of any kind of productive property or other wealth, the only way they're going to get to productive property, an ownership over some means of production or means of of private economy is through the ability to earn wages and save them. And so getting rid of the wage system, as the communists would propose, and just pulling everything and putting it in the hands of a state is not the solution. And so Leo basically cuts through this, that capitalism has concentrated wealth in the hands of a few who have basically put on everyone else a yoke a little better than slavery. What socialism has to offer is not only injurious to the very people that it pretends to help, but also it is in violation of principles of justice and perennial principles of right reason and the way that the state should operate. And so he offers a middle road, as it were, solution. He basically says that the state does have a role here. The state is by protecting private ownership, first and foremost, against the attacks and the vagaries of the communists. So private ownership, he says, must be held sacred and inviolable. However, the law should promote ownership to be as widespread as possible. And in that quotation where he says that, this is just sort of a preview for those tuning in, right before he talks about this is where he says it's in the prerogative of the state to act towards every class. This means both ownership and labor, with strict justice, and particularly that form of justice which is called distributive. And it is from the word distributive justice, or the category of distributive justice, that distributism or distributivism comes. So it has nothing to do with the distribution concretely. It really has nothing to do with the distribution of wealth, the redistribution of wealth. It has to do with the category of distributive justice. And what does distributive justice mean? It means that the community has obligations towards the members of a community. If I live in a community that has a common good to which I must contribute, and I do contribute by my labors and by my very presence, I also then have a share in and share of that common good. And it should also...
You have a stake in it. You have a stake in your neighborhood, right?
It should reward me too. It should be of benefit to me to live in this community if I'm going to serve this community. And so it's really not that complicated of a concept, but it is so greatly misunderstood. And so that notion of the practical way of getting out of this morass that they found themselves in the late 19th and early 20th century being not socialization of wealth and ownership of property in the hands of the state, but also neither ownership of all the productive property in the hands of the few, which Leo XIII and others, Chesterton and Belloc following him, would condemn, but rather that every man have the ability to have some small share of productive property for himself. And it is that productive property that's important. This isn't talking about, having, being able to own Adirondack chairs, right, on your, and put them on your porch. That's not what this is talking about. This is talking about as nice as that is. And of course, yes, you have right to that use, but this is specifically ownership. When Leo XIII, as you're reading this encyclical, whenever you see the word own or ownership, you have to almost treat it as a term of art. This is within the discourse, within the dialectic of economics, and specifically economics in dealing with Marx. And Leo XIII was definitely aware of kind of the Marxist lexicon, and so he's using ownership and property, those terms, or capital. He's using all these in very much kind of the same idiom, so that they resonate, so that they pierce through. Yeah. So this is kind of the way you have to read this.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. And I think it's, in some of the conversations that I've had about distributism and what we call the society, a lot of times localism, right, is this idea of being self-sufficient. And you can see where I think Rerum Novarum is maybe having sort of a second genesis in our day and age, especially in the technology age, of kind of a back to the land movement, right? This idea of going back to the land and being self-sufficient as a family, and kind of owning production out of your own society that you're making as a family and things like that. And I think there's a lot of benefits to it, but I think kind of one of the fun conversations of Q&As that I've had in the past are, I want to do that, and I want to go move to the farm, but I also want to, I want to make my production so high at the farm that I become a millionaire and I don't have to work anymore. And it's like, yep, well, now you've just crossed over into sort of another mode of thought and idea, and that's not what we're getting at, right? With distributism, and again, I think this is a great sound. A great clip that you made just a couple of minutes ago. We're not talking about the redistribution of wealth. That isn't it. Right. I mean, it's a completely different concept that we're talking about. And we're also not talking about the concept of being self-sufficient to where everyone can own their own business, to become their own millionaires, to then, you're getting into the cycle again of kind of this capitalistic sort of mentality of who's the richest and things like that. So again, it's funny how it always gravitates toward this kind of competitive nature. And I think that's a very American thing probably too, but it's competitive nature. But that's what's so great about this document as well, is it speaks specifically to that. It talks about, the wealth of owners becoming masters of their own labor, essentially, right?
Well, this is probably, I think, maybe where this episode we could kind of put a lid on it and lean forward now as we move forward in discussing not only further some of the specific things that this encyclical maybe says, but also just how it develops, what comes out of it, how particularly Chesterton and Belloc work with it. But if you understand nothing else from this, it's this more robust understanding of ownership and property, which ownership and property are the essential, the kernel, the core ideas of Belloc and Chesterton's system and thought. It's all about private ownership. It's all about the possession of property in this vein, in this proper sense. And so about that, I just want to say two things. We're not talking, as you said, about the distribution of wealth, wealth being distributed. We are talking about productive property being widely distributed. What do we mean by that? We hear distributed because English language maybe has, I think, a little bit of a weakness in this sense. We hear it simply as a passive verb. But distributive could be gerundive in nature or in the participle form as a noun, right? When I look at a graph and there are data on the graph, and those data are all concentrated in one little cluster, in one little sector of the graph, we would say that data are poorly distributed. Those data are poorly distributed. If instead we see a scattering of the data all over the graph, occupying every quadrant, we would say that is well distributed data. This is the kind of sense when we talk about property being well distributed. It's there's no prescription, there's no assumption about how this is to be done. As a matter of fact, the only one that Leo defends is that people be allowed to make a just wage so that they can have a little bit of their wage left up to save, to then gain this kind of property for themselves, and that will help the distribution of it. You're never going to get them if you're defrauding men of their wages or paying them under a living wage. You're also never going to get there if you just socialize all the property and put it in the hands of the state, or try to trust the state to do some kind of redistribution scheme, because, of course, they're just going to keep it for themselves. So that's what we're talking about with the distribution of property. Ironically, wealth, the whole point of this is that you distribute property more because Leo says that this leads to a diligence and a pride in the generation of wealth, right, and it will lead to the growth of more wealth. And I do think that this is where capitalism as a system wins out over communism. That when individuals have a interest in something, an ability to take pride in it, they will do more with it. They'll produce more. And this is why I think capitalism has succeeded in rising people out of poverty. But as Chesterton noted, the problem with capitalism is not that there are too many capitalists. It is that there are too few. Too few of the people of the society are of the capital owning class, right? So you want to generate wealth by this wider distribution of property. Ironically, once the wealth is generated, then it becomes a matter of, in Leo's thinking it becomes a matter of divine law, considering what you do with it, right? Because if it's not productive, if it's not something that you can actually then further benefit society with, you're only allowed a certain amount. And this is from the gospel forward. It is difficult for a rich man to enter the gates, right? And he says, according to an ancient principle, he's quoting Aquinas. He's referencing Aquinas particularly, but this goes back to the fathers of the church, and even as I said, the gospel itself. He writes, "Man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all, so as to share them without hesitation when others are in need, and when what necessity demands has been supplied, and one's standing in society fairly taken thought for." Meaning, you can have a certain state in life if you have to have a tuxedo to be the Knight of Columbus or whatever, you can have enough to buy a tuxedo. That's not a luxury at that point. But once those things are taken duly account for, it becomes a duty, Leo says, to give to the indigent out of what remains left over. And that idea of the common destination of goods and stuff is something that we're going to need to keep reminding people of, because that's part of this critique that Leo makes that I think almost everybody forgets.
No, that's fantastic. Lots to unpack. I think this is going to be a really exciting conversation going forward. Let's maybe save that for next time for sure. We've unpacked a lot, gone through the history of Pope Leo XIII and why that. We're going to touch on why that might be significant in the coming weeks as we talk about Pope Leo XIV and what that might mean for his papacy. But this is going to be a fun ride. This is going to be a fun conversation. We may have a couple of special guests join us as well to kind of unwrap distributism and localism from here at the Society. So I would absolutely encourage everyone, if you're not a subscriber, make sure that you're subscribing so that you can be a part of these conversations as we go forward. This is a really important and fun topic that we're going to be diving into. And Joe, fantastic job today. Thanks for giving us a little history lesson on Rerum Novarum, on Pope Leo XIII, and all of the history of Vatican I. Really appreciate your time.
It's been an absolute pleasure. As you could tell, I could go on all day about this.
Yeah. So. Absolutely, and we will. We'll put it into smaller chunks for people to dissect with us. But yeah, really looking forward to future conversations, and we'll continue to unwrap what it means to be a distributist and localist in this day and age, and what that means for the future, especially when it comes to kind of our new industrial revolution of artificial intelligence. So stay tuned for that.
All right. God bless.